Different analytical centers evaluate Henry Kissinger's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos on January 17 differently. For example, the Post notes that Kissinger spoke about full membership of Ukraine in NATO, and that Kissinger clarified that this would be appropriate after peace is ensured. As it is known, the patriarch of foreign policy until recently had a somewhat different view on the Ukrainian perspective. He was against Ukraine's accession to NATO until the full-scale invasion of Russia, but the massive support for the struggle of the Ukrainian people by the nations of the world's largest democracies obviously changed Kissinger's views. Before this war, I was against Ukraine's membership in NATO because I was afraid that it would start the same process that we are seeing now. But now, the idea of a neutral Ukraine in these circumstances no longer makes sense, he said. As it is known, after a month of fighting in 2022, in March, the first contact was made between the negotiating delegations of Ukraine and the Russian Federation, which Kissinger reminded us of, and at that time Ukrainian neutrality was a key demand of Russia during the negotiations. The project with 15 points involved Kyiv giving up its ambitions to join NATO and agreeing not to host foreign military bases or weapons in exchange for protection from allies such as the US, UK, and Turkey. The negotiations fell apart and soon both sides' positions became more intense. Now, the Kremlin says Kyiv must recognize Moscow's annexation of 4 southern and eastern regions of Ukraine, while Kyiv demands that every Russian soldier leaves its territory, including Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, as Moscow announced further annexations in September, the Post clarifies. However, the publication now notes a change in the position of the U.S. Secretary of State, who previously criticized Ukraine's accession to NATO, and emphasizes the importance of Kissinger's key position change. In September, he told the International Relations Committee that such a move would be foolish because it would lead to further escalation of the conflict. Last month, he called for a ceasefire in which Russia would withdraw to the demarcation line before the February invasion, but Crimea would be subject to negotiations. He hinted at Ukraine's membership in NATO, saying that both should be linked, but his comments today were the most frank, the Post notes. Now it is worth turning attention to the maneuvers of the Russian Federation after the grain agreement was signed by separate documents between Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN, as well as between Russia, Turkey, and the UN. Putin tried to develop this agreement into multi-level actions by Ukraine. This article by Kissinger was published in The Spectator on December 12 and describes Putin's efforts in its development, titled How to Avoid Another World War. In it, he presented his controversial view on the finalization of the war in Ukraine, which can be called, to say the least, contradictory. In particular, Kissinger suggested that returning to the borders of February 24 could be a compromise and that further negotiations, possibly including referendums in disputed territories, could resolve the conflict. At the time, many saw this idea as a proposal from the Kremlin itself, voiced by the 99-year-old Kissinger to give particular weight to a willingness to compromise. But in reality, it was a primitive intention to trade Ukrainian territories with Putin in exchange for a ceasefire. This idea did not offer any lasting resolution to the conflict. Now Kissinger's initiative is also synchronized with certain Kremlin efforts. Literally on the eve of the publication of Kissinger's initiative, the Kremlin published the outline of a new formula for 2 Ukraines, and this was an article signed by Medvedchuk in the Russian publication Izvestia. Therefore, suspicions persist that Kissinger is still playing into the Kremlin's hands, but from time to time new limits of retreat from the Kremlin are voiced through the patriarch. That is, betting on military victories makes the Kremlin an open loser even in the eyes of its own society. And here, when the question arises about Putin's own participation in managing post-war Russia, Putin understands perfectly well that he will not be able to keep his power. Therefore, through Kissinger, the Kremlin is essentially buying itself additional time in the hope that, as in a well-known fable, either the donkey or the padishah will die. But even if the donkey dies and the padishah dies, it seems that Kissinger will be bargaining for influence in the interests of the deceased. If these deceased are from the Kremlin,